The dust of redemption, Nevada, was a fine, gritty powder that coated everything, a constant reminder that the desert was patient and would one day reclaim the town and everyone in it. For Birdie, it was the taste of rock bottom. It clung to the hem of her worn dress, settled in the creases of her face, and worked its way into the simple bread she ate, making every bite a penance. She had walked the last 10 miles, the soles of her shoes worn to whispers. When the sprawling, almost arrogant expanse of the Circle A ranch finally rose from the heat haze, she didn't feel relief, only a new and more specific kind of dread. It was a kingdom of wood and leather and masculine authority, ruled by a man whose name was spoken in the town's only saloon with a mixture of fear and respect. Arden. He owned the most land, the best horses, and the coldest heart in the territory. Birdie had learned that much in the 2 days she'd spent trying to find work as a laundress or a cook. Her requests met with pinched faces and suspicious eyes. A woman alone was a problem or a temptation, and no one in Redemption wanted either. The Circle A was her last hope, a desperate prayer hurled at a closed door. She found him not in the imposing ranch house that sat on a low hill like a king surveying his subjects, but in the corrals. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, made broader by a leather vest and the sheer weight of the silence that surrounded him. His hands, resting on the top rail of a fence, were big and competent, the kind that could build a house or end a life with equal efficiency. He was watching a whirlwind of black fury kick up dust inside the round pen, a stallion that was more demon than horse, all bared teeth and rolling eyes. Birdie stopped a respectful distance away, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The cowhands leaning against the surrounding fences paid her no mind, their attention locked on the spectacle. Their talk was a low rumble of curses and nervous laughter. She waited. She had learned the art of waiting, of making herself small and unthreatening, a skill honed by a life that had offered her little else. Finally, one of the hands noticed her, a scarecrow of a woman with dust in her hair and desperation in her eyes. He nudged his neighbor, who nudged the next man, and soon a current of awareness rippled through the group. The laughter died. The men stared, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Still, the man at the fence, Arden, did not turn. He remained focused on the horse, as if willing it into submission through sheer force of presence. Birdie cleared her throat, a small, dry sound. "Mr. Arden?" He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept over her. It was not a look of welcome or even inquiry. It was a look of assessment, quick and dismissive, the kind a man gives a lame horse he's about to put down. He was younger than she expected, but his face was carved with lines of a man much older, etched by sun and something deeper. Something that looked a lot like grief. "I'm looking for work," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Any work. I can cook. I can clean. I'm strong." Arden's gaze flickered over her thin frame, her calloused but clearly not strong hands. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "The house is managed by my sister-in-law. We don't need a cook. We don't need a laundress." His voice was flat, a gravel road that led nowhere you wanted to go. It was a dismissal. The final one. Behind him, the black stallion slammed its body against the fence, a sound like a thunderclap. The men scrambled back. Birdie didn't flinch. Her eyes were on the horse. She saw past the rage, past the wildness. She saw the terror that fueled it. The animal was trapped and knew it, fighting the only way it could. "What about horses?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence. A snort of derisive laughter came from one of the cowhands, a thick-necked man with a mean-looking smile who she would later learn was the foreman, Jed. "What about 'em, lady? You aim to scrub 'em clean?" The men chuckled. Arden's gaze narrowed on Birdie, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "We have men for the horses," he said. "You have men who can't ride that one," Bertie said, nodding toward the round pen. It was a reckless thing to say, a challenge she couldn't afford. But the words came out before she could stop them. They were born of a deep, instinctual knowledge she couldn't explain. She knew horses. It was the only thing she had ever truly known. The foreman, Jed, stepped forward. "That there is chaos. Threw 3 men this morning. Broke Miller's arm yesterday. There ain't a man here who can stay on him, let alone a slip of a thing like you." Arden looked from Bertie's steady gaze to the horse and back again. The air crackled with tension. He was a man who appreciated audacity, even if he didn't suffer fools. He was about to tell her to get off his land, to take her nonsense and her starving eyes and disappear. But then he saw it again. The way she looked at the horse. It wasn't with fear or bravado. It was with a kind of profound, unnerving understanding. As if she were listening to a conversation no one else could hear. "You think you can ride him?" Arden's voice was a low challenge. "I think I can calm him," she corrected softly. "Riding comes after." A murmur went through the Cowhands. Jed laughed out loud. "I got $20, says she don't even get the saddle on." "I'll take that bet," another voice said. "20 says she's in the dust in the first minute." "An hour," another one called out. "I'll give her an hour before she's crying for her mama." "Any takers?" The bets flew, a currency of mockery and disbelief. They were betting on her failure, her humiliation. Bertie felt a flush of shame, but she pushed it down. Shame was a luxury she couldn't afford. She kept her eyes on Arden. He was the only one who mattered. He hadn't spoken. He was watching her, his expression a mask of stone. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Jed, let her in." It wasn't an act of kindness. It was a sentence. He was going to let the horse break her so he wouldn't have to. He was going to make an example of her foolishness. But as she walked toward the gate, her worn-out dress whispering in the dust, she felt a strange calm settle over her. She was in her element now. The world of men and their cruelties faded. There was only the dust, the horse, and the language of silence they were about to share. Jed swung the gate open with a smirk, then slammed it shut behind her, the sound of the latch clicking into place like the door of a cell. The round pen suddenly felt vast, the circle of leering faces a distant blur. All that existed was the hot sun, the packed earth, and the magnificent, terrified creature circling the perimeter. Chaos. He was beautiful, a living sculpture of muscle and midnight, his coat slick with sweat, his breath coming in ragged snorts. Bertie didn't move toward him. She stood in the center of the pen and simply breathed. She emptied her mind of the men, of their bets, of her hunger and her fear. She thought of the horse's fear instead. She let her shoulders slump, making herself smaller. She untied the bonnet from her head and let it fall to the dust, shaking her hair loose. She was not a predator. She was not a threat. The horse continued its frantic circling, its eyes rolling to keep her in view. It expected a rope, a whip, a man's brute force. It did not expect this stillness. Bertie began to hum, a low, tuneless sound from the back of her throat, the same sound she had used to soothe her father's nervous mares as a child. It was a sound that meant nothing and everything. It meant peace. Slowly, the stallion's pace began to slow. His frantic snorts softened. He was still wary, his ears twitching, but the sheer panic was subsiding. He took a few more wide circles, then a few smaller ones. Bertie did not move. She just hummed and waited. She turned her body slightly, presenting her side, not her front. An invitation, not a challenge. The horse stopped. He stood on the far side of the pen, his head high, his nostrils flaring, testing the air. He looked at her. really looked at her. Bertie took one slow, deliberate step sideways. The horse tensed, but did not bolt. She took another, and another. She wasn't walking toward him, but closing the circle, moving with him, not at him. She began to speak, her voice a low murmur. "Easy now. Easy, big fellow. No one's going to hurt you. You're just scared is all. I know what that's like." From the fence line, the men were silent. The smirks had vanished, replaced by looks of stunned disbelief. Jed's face was a thundercloud. Arden stood unmoving, his knuckles white where he gripped the rail. He was watching her hands, the way they stayed open and low. He was watching her eyes, which never left the horse. It took the better part of an hour, a slow, patient dance of advance and retreat. Finally, she was close enough to smell the sweat and fear coming off the animal. She reached out her hand, slow and steady, not toward his head, but toward his shoulder. He flinched, his skin quivering like a struck drum. She held her hand there, inches away, letting him feel her stillness, her lack of intent. His head dropped. He blew a long, shuddering breath through his nose, and then he leaned in and touched her palm with his velvety muzzle. A collective gasp went through the cowhands. Bertie closed her eyes for a second, a wave of profound connection washing over her. She stroked his neck, her fingers finding the tense cords of muscle. She kept murmuring, nonsense words, soothing sounds, a litany of peace. "Saddle," she said, her voice still quiet but clear. No one moved. They were frozen. "The saddle." Arden's voice cut through the stupor, sharp and commanding. "Get her the saddle, and a bridle. No bit." Jed moved as if in a trance, fetching the gear. He handed it over the fence to her. Bertie laid the blanket on the stallion's back. He trembled but stood. She lifted the heavy leather saddle. It was a struggle, but she managed, settling it gently. He didn't move. She reached under his belly for the cinch, her movements slow and predictable. He stood like a stone statue. She slipped the simple hackamore over his head, her fingers gentle around his ears. She didn't use the stirrup. She led him to the fence, a few feet from where Arden stood. She put her foot on the lowest rail and swung herself onto his back, settling as lightly as a leaf. The horse tensed beneath her, a coiled spring of power and memory. The men held their breath. This was the moment. Bertie leaned forward, her cheek close to his neck. "Just a walk," she whispered. "That's all? Just a walk." She didn't use her heels. She didn't use the reins. She shifted her weight, a subtle, fluid movement, a silent question. And the horse answered. He took one step, then another. They walked a slow, calm circle around the pen. Bertie sat straight, her hands resting on her thighs, the reins loose on his neck. They were a single creature, moving in perfect, impossible harmony. They walked and walked. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A bell rang from the direction of the cookhouse. "Supper." Jed looked at Arden, a question in his eyes. Arden didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on the woman and the horse, a strange, haunted expression on his face. He watched as the men, one by one, broke away from the fence, their bets forgotten, their faces etched with a grudging, bewildered respect. They shuffled toward the cookhouse, their spurs ringing a quiet, defeated rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Jed was the last to leave. He spat in the dust and stalked away, his shoulders stiff with fury. Soon it was just the three of them. Bertie, the horse, and Arden, separated by a few feet of wood and a chasm of unspoken things. She finally brought the horse to a stop in front of him. She looked down at his face, shadowed by his hat. "The hour is up," she said, her voice a little hoarse, "and then some." Arden lifted his head, and in the fading light she saw the cracks in the stone mask. She saw the damage. She saw a man who had been broken by something far more violent than a horse. "He's yours," Arden said, his voice rough. "The horse. His name is Sojourner now. You have a job." He turned and walked away toward the dark, silent ranch house without another word, leaving her sitting on the back of a miracle in the deepening twilight. The bunkhouse was a long, low building that smelled of unwashed men, cheap tobacco, and leather. Her corner was a small space by a drafty window, furnished with a narrow cot and a single nail in the wall for her belongings. It was more than she'd had the night before, and she was grateful for it. The men gave her a wide berth, their earlier mockery replaced by a wary, resentful silence. She ate the tasteless stew and hard bread in a corner, feeling their eyes on her back. Jed, the foreman, made a point of ignoring her existence entirely. He held court at the head of the long table, his voice louder than necessary, his laughter a harsh, grating sound. He was a man whose authority had been challenged, and he was making sure everyone knew it was a temporary state of affairs. Birdie knew men like Jed. They saw strength in a woman as a personal affront. She would have to be careful. She finished her meal quickly and slipped out into the cool night air. The stars were a brilliant, scattered canopy, more vivid than any she had ever seen. A low nicker drew her attention to a small private corral near the barn. Sojourner. Arden had put him there for her. She climbed the fence and sat on the top rail just watching him. He moved with a new grace, a confidence that hadn't been there before. He wasn't healed, not yet. But he was no longer alone in his fear. Neither was she. A few days fell into a rhythm. Birdie was up before dawn, tending to Sojourner, brushing his coat until it shone like polished jet, checking his hooves, talking to him in the low, murmuring tones that were her secret language. Then she would move to the other horses, the ones the men were too rough or too impatient with. A nervous filly that shied from the bridle, a stubborn gelding that refused to be shod. She didn't use force, she used patience, she used time, she used a quiet understanding that seemed to flow from her hands. Arden watched her. She would catch glimpses of him, standing on the porch of the main house with a cup of coffee, or by the barn, his arms crossed over his chest. He never spoke to her. He never approached. But he was always watching. It was an unnerving, intense scrutiny, and she didn't know what to make of it. He was like a man staring into a fire, trying to decide if it would warm him or burn him down. One morning, she was struggling to mend a piece of tack, her fingers clumsy with the thick needle and stiff leather. She left it, frustrated, to do other chores. When she came back an hour later, a small, worn wooden stool sat beside her work area, the perfect height for the task. It hadn't been there before. There was no one around. She looked toward the main house, but the porch was empty. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. The Cowhands, for their part, were slowly, grudgingly beginning to change. They saw the results of her work. The horses were calmer, more responsive. The nervous filly now took the bridle without a fight. The stubborn gelding stood patiently for the farrier. They still didn't talk to her much, but the open hostility had faded into a kind of neutral curiosity. All except for Jed. His resentment festered, growing with every small success she had. He found fault where there was none, giving her the worst jobs, the most broken equipment, trying to catch her in a mistake. She just kept her head down and did the work. A cold snap hit the territory, bringing with it a biting wind that cut through her thin dress. She spent her days shivering, her hands raw and red from the cold. One evening, she returned to her corner of the bunkhouse to find a thick wool coat hanging from the nail on the wall. It was a man's coat, worn and frayed at the cuffs, but heavy and warm. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and him. Arden. She held it to her face, a foolish secret gesture, and breathed in the scent. The next day, she wore it, It was too big. The sleeves rolled up, but it was a shield against the cold and, in a strange way, against the loneliness. She saw him across the yard that afternoon. He was wearing a newer coat. His eyes met hers for a brief second, and he gave a barely perceptible nod before turning away. It was a language of gestures, of things unsaid. A bucket of fresh water left by Sojourner's corral in the morning. A perfectly mended tear in his work shirt she'd found discarded, which she had taken and stitched in the dark, leaving it folded neatly where she had found it. He wore it the next day, his fingers tracing the invisible seam as he passed her. They were circling each other just as she had circled the horse, in a slow, cautious dance of trust. The slow burn of their connection was tested when the first snows came, thick and heavy, blanketing the ranch in a world of white. A young calf went missing from a herd pastured in the high meadows. Jed and 2 other men rode out and returned at dusk, empty-handed and half-frozen, declaring the calf lost to the storm or to wolves. "It's a write-off," Jed announced to Arden in the barn, stamping the snow from his boots. "No track to follow. It's gone." Arden's face was grim. He hated losing any animal. Bertie, who had been quietly refilling hay mangers, stepped out of the shadows. "Its mother is in the north pasture," she said softly. "By the creek bed with the cottonwoods. She keeps looking that way. The calf won't have gone far from where it last nursed." Jed scoffed. "And how would you know that? Reading tea leaves?" "I know mothers," Bertie said, her voice firm. She didn't look at Jed. She looked at Arden. "A mother knows. She'll be huddled in the lee of the rocks on the east side of that creek, trying to keep warm." Arden studied her face for a long moment, the firelight from the lantern playing over her features. He saw a certainty there that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with instinct. "Saddle, Sojourner," he said to her, ignoring Jed's sputtering protest. "And my bay." He turned to the foreman. "You and the men get warm. We'll handle this." The ride was a world of white silence, the only sound the muffled crunch of the horses' hooves in the snow and the whistle of the wind. They rode side by side, not speaking. The cold was bitter, but inside Arden's coat, Bertie felt a core of warmth. They found the frantic mother cow exactly where Bertie had said she would be. And 100 yards away, tucked into a shallow alcove in the rocks, shivering but alive, was the calf. It was too weak to walk far. Arden dismounted and, with a grunt of effort, hoisted the calf across the front of his saddle. Remounting was awkward. He was off balance. Bertie slid from Sojourner's back and came to his side. "Let me," she said. She took the reins of his horse, her small gloved hands brushing his. A jolt, sharp and warm, passed between them. She led the horse, breaking a trail through the deeper snowdrifts, while he steadied the calf. On the way back, he finally broke the silence. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice rough and unused to the name. She would have known, too, about the calf. Bertie's heart ached for him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just nodded and kept walking, sharing the burden of his memory in the quiet, snowy dark. When they got back to the barn, the other men were gathered, their faces a mixture of surprise and admiration. Jed's was a mask of pure poison. He watched as Arden carefully unloaded the calf into a warm stall, and as Bertie began rubbing down the shivering horses. He saw the way Arden looked at her, a look of unguarded respect, and something in him snapped. The next day, Jed found Bertie alone, polishing tack in the barn. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he sneered, blocking her path. "Coming here, playing the horse whisperer? You think the boss is sweet on you? He ain't. He's just using you. He feels sorry for you, like a stray dog. But even stray dogs get put down when they get to be a nuisance." "I'm just doing my job, Jed," she said, trying to step around him. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in like claws. Your job is what I say it is, and I say you're done here. You're a witch, is what you are. You've put a spell on that horse, and on him. But it's gonna wear off, and when it does, you'll have nothing. Let go of me, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Or what? He taunted, his face close to hers, his breath foul. Or he'll have to let go of you. Arden's voice was deathly quiet. He stood in the wide doorway of the barn, a silhouette against the bright morning sun. He didn't look angry. He looked cold. Colder than the snow, colder than the wind. It was a terrifying stillness. Jed dropped her arm as if it were a hot iron. He stammered, "Boss, I was just telling her." "I know what you were telling her," Arden said, taking a slow step into the barn. "Pack your things. I want you off my land in an hour." "But, boss, I've been with you for 10 years. And in 10 minutes, you've shown me who you really are," Arden said, his voice flat. "Get out." Jed stared at him, then at Bertie, his face a contorted mask of hatred. He spat on the floor, turned, and stormed out of the barn. The silence he left behind was heavy. Bertie rubbed her arm where his fingers had been, a tremor running through her. Arden came closer. He stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Did he hurt you?" he asked, his voice raw. She shook her head, unable to speak. He took a step closer, then stopped himself. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a storm of emotion she couldn't begin to name. He looked at the tack she was mending, at her small, capable hands, at the oversized coat she wore. He looked like a man on the edge of a cliff. "He was right about one thing," Arden said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't feel sorry for you." He turned and left the barn, leaving her with the words hanging in the air, a promise and a threat all at once. The space between them had shrunk, but the danger had only grown. The entire ranch had seen the foreman dismissed for laying a hand on her. She was no longer just the strange woman who could ride a wild horse. She was under Arden's protection. And on the frontier, protection like that was a kind of cage. The departure of Jed sent a ripple of unease through the ranch. The men, who had been slowly warming to Bertie, now treated her with a new, more complicated deference. She was no longer just one of them. She was something other. The object of the boss's favor. It was an isolating promotion. The whispers didn't stop. They just changed their tune. They were no longer about her incompetence, but about her influence. Arden seemed to retreat after the confrontation. He became more remote than ever, a ghost on his own ranch. He took long rides alone, returning well after dark. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and formal, his eyes avoiding hers. The fragile bridge of unspoken gestures they had built between them seemed to have been washed away. Bertie felt the loss like a physical ache. She had cracked the wall around his heart, and he was now frantically trying to rebuild it, stone by cold stone. She poured herself into her work, finding solace in the simple, honest company of the horses. Sojourner was her shadow, his transformation complete. He was no longer chaos, the demon of the round pen, but a calm, intelligent companion who followed her without a lead rope and rested his head on her shoulder when she was weary. He was proof that trust, once broken, could be mended. She held on to that hope like a prayer. One afternoon, a lavish carriage, far too fancy for redemption, rolled up the long drive to the ranch house. A woman emerged, dressed in Eastern finery, her hair perfectly coiffed, her face a mask of polite condescension. It was Arden's sister-in-law, Beatrice, the one who managed his house. She had been visiting family back east and had returned, unannounced. Bertie watched from the stables as Beatrice swept into the house that had been Sarah's, her voice carrying on the wind, a high, sharp sound of command. Later that day, Beatrice came to the stables. She walked through the clean, well-ordered space as if it were a slum, her nose wrinkled. "You must be the horse girl," she said, her eyes cataloging Bertie's worn dress and the smudge of dirt on her cheek. It wasn't a question. "Arden tells me you have a knack." The word was an insult. "I work with the horses, yes, ma'am," Bertie said, her voice even. "I see," Beatrice said, though her eyes said she saw nothing of value. "Well, Arden has been unwell since my sister's passing. He is not himself. He is prone to sentiment. It is my duty as family to protect him from it, and from those who would take advantage of it." The threat was clear, wrapped in the silk of propriety. "See that you remember your place." Beatrice became a constant, suffocating presence. She took over the running of the house with an iron fist, her disapproval a palpable force. She insisted Arden join her for formal dinners he clearly despised. She spoke of his late wife, Sarah, constantly, but her words were not of loving memory. They were weapons, used to remind Arden of his grief and his duty, and to paint Bertie as an unworthy interloper. The threat that had been simmering now had a face and a name. Beatrice was the town matriarch in her own mind, the guardian of Arden's legacy, and she saw Bertie as a direct threat to the social order she was trying to impose. She began a quiet campaign against her. She complained to Arden that Bertie was a distraction to the men, that her presence was unseemly. She spread subtle rumors in town when she went for supplies, painting a picture of a cunning woman who had bewitched her broken-hearted brother-in-law. The final straw came during a community barn raising for a neighbor whose property had burned. It was a social event, and Beatrice insisted Arden attend for appearances. To everyone's surprise, he insisted on bringing a team of his best horses to help with the heavy lifting, and he told Bertie she was to come and manage them. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she worked the team, her quiet commands and gentle touch a stark contrast to the shouting and whipping of the other men. She was efficient, she was skilled, and it was undeniable. Arden stood nearby, not helping, just watching, his presence a silent declaration. Beatrice, seeing her campaign of whispers failing, decided on a public confrontation. During the midday meal, when the whole community was gathered, she approached Bertie, a cup of lemonade in her hand. "You must be so proud," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness, loud enough for all to hear. "To have come so far. From a penniless drifter to the master of my brother-in-law's horses." Bertie did not rise to the bait. "I'm grateful for the work, ma'am." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Beatrice continued, her smile tightening. "It's amazing what a woman can achieve with the right kind of assets. My poor sister Sarah, she only had her goodness and her love to offer. It seems the modern woman has other more effective tools at her disposal." The meaning was unmistakable. The crowd fell silent. A woman gasped. Bertie felt the blood drain from her face. It was a public branding, an accusation of the worst kind. She was being called a whore in front of the entire community, in front of him. She looked for Arden, her heart pounding. He was standing by the half-finished barn, his face like thunder. He started toward them, his hands clenched. This was it, the moment of truth. He would defend her. He had to. But before he could reach them, a man stepped between him and the crowd, the sheriff, and beside him stood a grim-faced stranger in a dusty suit. "Arden," the sheriff said, his voice heavy. "This man's a marshal from back east. He has a warrant." The marshal unfolded a piece of paper. "I have a warrant for the arrest of one Bertie, or rather, Roberta Lee Carter, for the crime of abandoning her husband and absconding with his property." The world tilted on its axis. Every eye swung from Beatrice to Bertie. A new, more damning accusation had eclipsed the first. "Husband?" Arden's voice was a low growl. Beatrice let out a triumphant little gasp. "I knew it! A liar and a criminal!" Bertie stood frozen, the ground seeming to fall away beneath her feet. The past she had run so far and so hard from had finally caught up to her, and it had found her in the one place she had dared to feel safe, in front of the one man whose opinion had come to matter more than her own breath. She looked at Arden, and the flicker of hope she had seen in his eyes was gone, replaced by the old, familiar ice. The wall was back up, higher and colder than ever. The marshal's words hung in the air, a death sentence to the fragile life Bertie had built. The whispers around her surged, no longer just curious but venomous. A liar, a thief, a runaway wife. It was all true, and it was all a lie. She had run, yes. She had taken one horse, a broken-down mare that was the only thing her father had left her, the only thing her husband hadn't already sold for drink. She had run from a man whose love was a fist, whose promises were bruises. But in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of these people, she was a criminal. She looked at Arden. His face was a mask of granite. The man who had watched her gentle a wild horse, who had seen her find a lost calf in a snowstorm, who had fired his foreman for touching her, was gone. In his place stood the cold, powerful rancher, the man who had lost a wife and would not be made a fool of by another woman. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, a complete and utter stranger. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. She couldn't speak. A nod was a confession. A denial was a lie. The truth was too complicated, a story of pain and fear that had no place here, in this public spectacle. Her silence was her answer. The marshal stepped forward, a pair of iron handcuffs in his hand. "Mrs. Carter, you'll come with me." Bertie felt a profound, bottomless despair. It wasn't the cuffs or the jail cell she feared. It was the look in Arden's eyes, the look of disgust, the look of dismissal. He was retreating back into his fortress of grief, and this time he was locking the gate and throwing away the key. The connection she had thought was so strong, so real, had snapped like a rotten thread. She held out her hands. There was no point in fighting. She had been running her whole life. She was tired of running. But as the marshal reached for her, a blur of motion cut between them. Sojourner. The horse had been tethered nearby. He had pulled his reins free, and now he stood between Bertie and the lawmen, his head low, a dangerous rumble in his chest. He wasn't wild, he wasn't chaotic, he was protective. He planted his feet and refused to move, a living shield of black muscle. The crowd gasped. The marshal drew his pistol. "Get that beast under control." "He's not a beast," Bertie said, her voice finding its strength. She put a hand on Sojourner's neck. "He knows a heart before a man does." She looked directly at Arden, a final, desperate plea. Arden didn't move. He just stared, his face unreadable. He had been betrayed before, and his response was to shut down, to turn to ice. He saw a woman with a secret past, a warrant, a husband. He saw a complication, a danger to the careful, empty peace he had constructed. The rational choice was to let the law take its course, to wash his hands of her and the trouble she had brought to his door. Beatrice seized the moment. "Arden, do something! This is madness! She's a common criminal, and she has bewitched your animals. Let the marshal do his job." Bertie saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between the cold, damaged man he had become and the man who had left a stool for her in the barn. She saw him choose. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was over. He was letting her go. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She turned to the marshal. "It's all right," she said to the horse, her voice breaking. "It's all right, Sojourner. You can stand down." She prepared to leave, to be taken away, to disappear back into the dust from which she had come. The hope that had briefly bloomed in her heart withered and died. The lowest point had arrived, and it was a quiet, public humiliation, a final, irrevocable separation. As Bertie turned to surrender, a voice cut through the tense silence. It wasn't Arden's. It was a young cowhand, one of the first to have shown her a sliver of kindness. "That ain't the whole story," he said, stepping forward from the crowd. He was trembling, but he held his ground. "The man she ran from? He ain't no husband. Not in the eyes of God." All eyes turned to the young man. Beatrice looked scandalized. "What are you talking about, you foolish boy?" "I'm talking about the letters," he said, looking at Arden. "The ones she writes but never sends. I seen 'em. When I was cleaning the bunkhouse, she writes to her sister, writes about him, about what he did to her, the bruises, the way he sold off everything her pa left her. That mare she took, it was hers to begin with." The marshal looked uncomfortable. "That's a civil matter. The warrant is for theft and abandonment." "It ain't theft to take what's yours," the boy insisted, his voice gaining strength. "And it ain't abandonment to run for your life." A new silence fell, a thoughtful one this time. The women in the crowd looked at Bertie with new eyes, eyes of sympathy and recognition. They knew stories of men like that. But it was Arden who moved. He walked past the marshal, past Beatrice, past the stunned crowd. He walked until he stood directly in front of Bertie, his eyes searching her face. The ice was gone, replaced by a raging fire of self-recrimination. He had seen the truth in her all along, in her hands, in her patience, in her courage, and he had let the world's judgment blind him. He had almost let her go. He had almost let himself be destroyed by his own coldness. "The horse?" Arden said, his voice rough with emotion as he looked at Sojourner, who was still pressed against Bertie's side. "He never doubted you." He looked back at her. "He's a better judge of character than I am." This was his revelation. Not a grand speech, but a quiet admission of his own failure. He had built walls to keep the pain out, but he had only succeeded in locking himself in. She had shown him there was another way. Her quiet strength, her unwavering gentleness, had been saving him all along, and he had been too broken to see it. He turned to the marshal, his authority settling back onto his shoulders like a familiar coat, but this time it was tempered with something new. "Marshal, a warrant from a county 1,000 miles away, sworn out by a man of questionable character, holds little weight here, especially when the stolen property is a woman's life." He reached into his vest. For a terrifying second, Bertie thought he was reaching for a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick leather wallet. He counted out a stack of bills, more money than Bertie had ever seen. "This is for the horse," he said, pressing the money into the marshal's hand. "Whatever price her husband put on that mare, I'm paying it. Double. And this," he added another, smaller stack, "is for your time and trouble. Now, you can get on your horse and ride back east and tell Mr. Carter that his property is no longer his concern. It's under my protection now." It was a public, irreversible act. He was buying her freedom. He was choosing her over reputation, over safety, over the law. He was standing against the town, against his own family, for her. The marshal, a practical man, looked at the money in his hand, at the formidable rancher in front of him, and at the hostile-looking crowd of cowhands who had all taken a step forward and made a wise decision. He tipped his hat. "As you say, Mr. Arden, the matter is settled." He turned and walked away, his job done. Beatrice was apoplectic. "Arden, have you lost your mind? Paying for this fugitive? What will people say? Think of Sarah." Arden turned to face his sister-in-law, and for the first time, Bertie saw him truly healed. The grief was still there, a scar, but it no longer controlled him. "Sarah was a good woman, Beatrice," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. She would have been the first to offer this woman shelter. You have used her memory as a weapon for the last time. This is my house. This is my ranch. And this, he said, turning and holding his hand out to Bertie, is my home. You are no longer welcome in it. The crowd watched, breathless, as Bertie put her hand in his. It was not the gesture of a master to a servant, or a rescuer to a victim. It was the gesture of two equals, two survivors who had found in each other the missing piece of their own souls. He had saved her from the law, and she had saved him from himself. The rescue was mutual. As he led her through the silent, parting crowd toward the main house, she didn't feel like a Cinderella. She felt like a queen. A season turned. The last of the autumn gold faded from the cottonwoods, and the land settled into the quiet patience of winter. The scandal of the barn raising became old news, replaced by the more immediate concerns of firewood and stores for the cold months. Beatrice had left in a fury, her carriage rattling down the drive in a cloud of indignation, and a quiet peace had settled over the Circle A. Bertie did not move into the main house right away. That wasn't her way, and it wasn't his. The change was slow, organic, as natural as the turning of the earth. She took over one of the empty rooms in the back, one that looked out over the horse pastures. She filled it with small things, a jar of wildflowers she'd found by the creek, a smooth stone from the riverbed, a mended bridle she was working on. It became her space. Arden gave her the ranch ledgers. "I'm a stockman, not a clerk," he said one evening, dropping the heavy books on the kitchen table where she was having a cup of tea. "Jed always made a mess of them. I suspect you won't." It was his way of saying he trusted her intelligence, her judgment. She spent the long evenings by the fire, her careful script bringing order to years of chaotic scrawls, her keen eye finding discrepancies and efficiencies the men had missed for years. They worked side by side, a silent team. She took over the breeding program, her instinct for pairing mares and stallions proving almost magical. He consulted her on everything, from buying new stock to planning the spring roundup. The ranch began to thrive in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death. It was as if Bertie had breathed life back into the place and into its owner. The men treated her with a deep, abiding respect. She was Mrs. Bertie now, and her word on anything horse-related was law. The young hand who had spoken up for her became her right hand, his loyalty absolute. The ranch was no longer just a workplace, it was a community, and she was at its heart. One evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, they stood on the porch together, watching the flakes drift down and blanket the world in white. They had been standing in comfortable silence for a long time. "I never thanked you," she said softly, "for what you did, for believing me." He turned to her, his face softened by the dim light from the window. "I should have believed you sooner. You showed me what you were from the first day. I was just too blind to see it." He reached out and took her hand. His was large and calloused, hers smaller but no less strong. A perfect fit. "Some men build walls to keep the world out," he said, his voice thick. "You build fences to bring the lost ones home. You brought me home, Bertie." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture of such profound tenderness it made her heart ache. It was not the kiss of a master, but the vow of a partner. It was the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings, of shared burdens and shared joys. She had arrived at the Circle A with nothing but the dust on her dress and the ache in her soul. She had been dismissed, underestimated, and threatened. But she had proven herself, not with words, but with quiet competence and a strength of spirit that could not be broken. She had found a home not because a man had rescued her, but because she had helped build it. The frontier was still wild, the world still dangerous, but here, on this porch, with his hand in hers and the snow falling softly around them, she was safe. She was loved. She belonged. The world may remember stories of heroes and outlaws, of gunfights and gold rushes, but the truest stories of the West are the quiet ones, the ones etched not in headlines, but in the heart. Stories of resilience, of unexpected kindness, and of how love can take root in the most unforgiving soil. Have you ever found strength you didn't know you had when you were at your lowest? Let us know in the comments below. And for more stories that prove the heart is the wildest frontier of all, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring that notification bell. Because everyone deserves to find their own Circle A, a place where they are finally seen, valued, and home.